we know about our motherboard, and we've talked a bit about our motherboard sizes and different form factors that we have. Well, what are the different components that we actually have on the motherboard? What's some of the things that we're going to look for? One of the first things we're going to talk about is our input-output ports. When we take a look at our motherboard, on this model, this is our Extend ATX, we're going to have our rear input-output ports here. These can be things such as our USB ports, our serial connectors, our parallel connectors, our Ethernet adapter, and these input-output ports allow us actually come out of the computer case and allow us to interface with the motherboard. This is where we're going to put our mouse and keyboard. On this one, we not only have USB ports, but we also have the PS2 connectors for our mouse and our keyboard. We have our Ethernet. This one does not have a firewire connector, but sometimes you'll see those there built in there as well. But we do have our digital audio here built in already. Sometimes we'll have VGA and we'll have DVI connectors for our video. But essentially, these built-in ports these built-in input-output ports, rather, are what allow us to put this motherboard into a computer and get going with the built-in ports. We don't want to have to get a motherboard and then put in additional PCI slots, or rather PCI cards, just to be able to interface with the motherboard, just to be able to plug in a keyboard and a mouse. We want that to be built in on the motherboard. That's where those input-output ports come in handy. So let's go ahead and start building ourselves a motherboard here. We have our base motherboard, and we've already talked about our rear input-output ports. So we have our rear input-output ports here. The next thing we can notice right away are going to be our CPU slots. This is going to be where we actually place our CPU to interface with the motherboard. This can be different based on different computers, but different motherboards. Some of them are the CPU actually has pins on it, and the motherboard has the receiving holes. On some motherboards, the motherboard actually has the pins that come out, and the CPU has the holes that join in. And on some motherboards, on our older model here, the CPU actually stands up out of the motherboard and slides down into a slot. But whichever the case, our motherboard has to have a place where we can place a CPU. Because without a CPU, we don't have anything to process the information going through our motherboard. So we'll go ahead and build our CPU. Following this, of course, we have our memory. Our memory banks here, on this one we have 2 banks of 2, so we get 4 memory slots total. And these are generally located very close by to the CPU, because the CPU and the memory talk a lot. And the closer they are together, the faster the information can get between the two, the less distance it has to travel. So we'll go ahead and we'll build our memory. We also notice that we have our PCI slots, which gives us additional places to put, say, extended video cards, video graphics cards, sound cards, more Ethernet plugs. And these are located so that they're parallel to the bottom side, so that the end of the card can stick out of the back of our computer and we can actually plug into it. So we're going to have our PCI slots. We're going to add a couple more things on our computer, such as our CMOS battery, BIOS, and we also have several pins called jumpers, which we can place jumper blocks on them in order to connect them so that we can make additional configurations to our motherboard. And these pins may be all over our motherboard, and the only way to exactly know which pins do what is to read some good documentation on our particular motherboard in order to narrow those down. So we've built our motherboard here, and we've talked about some of the general components, how they interact with each other. And now we're going to go ahead and move on to our next segment where we break these down and talk about them more individually. Now that we know how they all work together, how the different types of each individual component and how they interact by themselves.